At 04:23 a.m., on February 19, 1944, deep inside the fog-drenched woods near Monte Cassino, Italy, radio operator Samuel "Sam" Halperin knelt behind a shattered stone wall with his SCR-300 pressed against his chest, as if it were a living thing he had sworn to protect. The 141st Infantry Battalion, to which he belonged, was scattered across the ravine below, pinned by German machine gun nests dug into the hillside. The sky was a dull charcoal blue, that kind of pre-dawn silence that looks peaceful from afar but feels like a noose tightening for every man on the ground. Sam adjusted the cracked dial with the edge of his glove, knowing that one mistake, one fraction of static at the wrong time, could send an entire company into the teeth of enemy fire. Halperin was only 23, a former telephone repairman from Newark, who had never held a rifle before joining the army. But he understood radios the way some men understood engines or horses. Since December, his commanders had relied on him to keep the battalion connected when the front lines shifted unpredictably. But that morning, something was different. The fog was thicker than usual. German jammers had intensified overnight, and the higher command had issued a plan Sam privately found suicidal. A coordinated push across the ravine that required precise timing between companies A, C, and the heavy weapons platoon. If communication failed for even a minute, men would walk into crossfire they could not see coming. The SCR-300 backpack radio was a marvel for its time. Frequency modulation, reduced static, and a range that on paper could reach nearly 3 miles. But Sam knew the truth buried beneath the Army's reassuring manuals. The set struggled in broken terrain. The vacuum tubes inside were delicate, temperamental, sometimes failing after a single drop. And when German operators swept the bands with interference, the radio could turn into a humming brick at the worst moment. The manual blamed operator error when signals failed. Everyone on the front blamed the damned fog, but Sam blamed the design flaw no one of rank wanted to acknowledge. Under real battle conditions, the SCR-300 simply couldn't push power through the interference fast enough, and the delay, often less than half a second, could scramble an outgoing call just enough to distort meaning. It had already cost lives. Sam carried those failures with him like ghosts stitched into his uniform seams. Corporal Daniel Kravitz, the gunner from Brooklyn who used to hum Sinatra while cleaning his bar, died 2 weeks earlier because the call to pull back reached him garbled. He turned right instead of left. They found him slumped against a tree, snow pooled in his open hand like crushed glass. Sergeant William "Mac" McCaffrey, stout Irishman from Chicago, had been hit by mortar shrapnel during a miscommunication when artillery coordinates arrived 3 seconds too late. And young Private Louis Delgado, barely 19, a quiet kid who talked about his mother's cooking, never made it back after a night patrol because the signal that was supposed to guide him home dissolved into static. The report said, possible disorientation, but Sam knew better. Every lost man pressed on Sam the same truth. The radio wasn't failing because operators didn't know what they were doing. It failed because the battlefield didn't care about manuals written in comfortable rear area offices. It responded only to reality, terrain, weather, frequency noise, and the brutal unpredictability of war. That morning, as the fog thickened over the ravine and German flares hissed faintly in the distance, Sam felt a familiar pressure building in his chest. Something was wrong with the signal. The delay spike had begun again, subtle but present, turning transmissions from Company A sluggish. He tapped the side of the radio, listened to the faint warble of the carrier wave, and recognized the pattern immediately. The enemy was sweeping the band from the hills above, searching for the battalion's communications. If they found it, every move would be predictable. If they jammed it, the battalion would be deaf and blind. Yet the order from Battalion HQ was clear. The assault would begin at 05 hours. No delays, no alternate routes, no improvisations. The radio net had to hold. Sam had known this moment would come. He had seen the signs over the past weeks, had listened to the creeping distortion in the headset during rehearsals, had watched the officers argue over maps while dismissing the radio men's warnings. He also knew the truth the officers didn't. Tucked inside the SCR-300 circuitry was a loophole he had discovered by accident, a way to bend the outgoing signal without changing frequency. It wasn't in any manual, it wasn't standard procedure, and it wasn't exactly safe. 3 weeks earlier, during a night operation near Venafro, Sam had noticed that when the power knob was set between its detents, not fully locked into position, but nudged just enough to alter the tube's heating curve, the outgoing signal gained a momentary burst of clarity. It cut through interference like a blade, but it also risked burning out the tube if held too long. A literal momentary trick, unstable, unapproved, and absolutely forbidden by protocol. If an inspector caught him doing it, he'd be reprimanded, or worse. But it had worked once, enough to bring a scattered platoon back under control for a critical 15 minutes. No one else dared to try it. No one else even knew what he had noticed. Now, with fog drowning the valley and the battalion minutes from moving into a kill zone, Sam felt that same cold, metallic tension coil through his hands. He looked around the ruins, the cracked stones, the half-buried helmet in the mud, the silent shapes of soldiers readying their gear. Every life in the ravine depended on timing, and timing depended on a signal that currently sputtered like a dying flame. The field manual told him to hold frequency, report distortion, wait for command. The battlefield told him that if he waited, if he obeyed, dozens of men from Colorado, Texas, and New Jersey would vanish into the fog, just like Kravitz, Mack, and Delgado. Sam swallowed hard. The decision he was about to make wasn't heroic. It wasn't glamorous. It was the kind of choice only a radio operator understood. A technical violation that could save lives or destroy equipment. A choice made in silence. Behind a wall, no one else noticed. The kind of choice history never recorded. He slid his thumb over the knob, feeling its familiar resistance. He remembered Kravitz humming Sinatra. He remembered Delgado's smile. He remembered the cold weight of every failed transmission that had cost a man his future. At 04:38 a.m., the fog pressing against his face like wet cloth, Sam Halperin inhaled once, exhaled slowly, and nudged the power knob out of regulation. The SCR 300 hummed. The distortion shifted, then stabilized into a tight, sharp carrier wave. For the first time that morning, the radio line cleared, and Sam realized he had just crossed the line between doing his job and risking everything for the men below. At 04:41 a.m., with the fog still clinging to the ravine like a living thing determined to swallow sound itself, Sam Halperin whispered into the handset and heard something he had not heard in days. A clean return signal. Not perfect. Nothing in war was perfect, but clear enough to slice through the German jamming and carry meaning without distortion. It startled him so much that he froze for a heartbeat, listening again, making sure it wasn't a fluke. He shifted his weight, adjusted the field telephone cord looped around his shoulder, and sent a second test burst to Company A. Thunder 1. Confirm ready. The reply came instantly, sharp and crisp. Thunder 1 ready. Clear copy. Clear copy. God, those words felt like breathing after drowning. Down in the ravine, shapes began to move. Men tightened chin straps, loaded rifles, tapped each other on the shoulder with the silent ritual of soldiers about to gamble everything on orders written by men far away. Sam watched the silhouettes blur and reform in the swirling fog and felt a hollow ache in his chest. Most of them had no idea how close they were to walking into chaos without warning. They placed their trust in the radio network, in him, without ever thinking about the fragile vacuum tubes humming inside his pack. At 04:46, a faint tremor of interference clattered through the earpiece. The Germans were still sweeping the band, searching for the battalion's net. Sam adjusted the improvised detent position gently, the way he had practiced alone during the nights when insomnia and guilt drove him back to the equipment. The frequency locked again, stable, narrow, steadying the line like a hand gripping a rope. He should not have been doing any of this. He knew that. The power knob was not meant to rest between positions. The tubes were not designed to heat at that curve. If the filament burned out mid-operation, the radio would go dead without warning. But what was the alternative? Static? Garbled orders? Another Kravitz? Another Delgado? Another man found at dusk with snow gathering on his uniform? Sam pressed the headset tighter against his ear and continued transmitting updates from Battalion HQ. The fog muted the distant artillery, turning thunder into dull thumps that vibrated through the ground rather than through the air. It felt like the earth itself was warning them. Move carefully, move precisely, or be buried in these hills like thousands before you. Only a week earlier, the 36th Infantry Division had tried to breach the German positions along the Rapido River. The assault turned into a massacre. Sam had listened to fragmented radio calls from battered companies caught in crossfire, drowning in freezing water, pleading for coordinates that never reached them. A lieutenant named Mendez, a man Sam had never met but whose voice he could still hear, had screamed for artillery smoke to cover withdrawal. The bandwidth died mid-sentence. When engineers later recovered the bodies, they found Mendez lying face down in the reeds, his radio half submerged, His last transmission strangled by interference. Sam had sworn that night, quietly, with no witnesses, that he would never let the airwaves fail like that again. At 04:52, Captain Hargrove leaned around the ruined wall where Sam was positioned. The captain's face was drawn tight, the kind of tightness that comes from ordering men into danger too many times. He didn't ask what Sam had done to the radio. Officers rarely wanted to know when procedures were bent as long as results held. Instead, he asked, "Signal holding?" Sam nodded. "Yes, sir. Clear line across all companies." Hargrove exhaled through his teeth, a brief, silent thank you wrapped in tension. "Good. At 05 hours we move." Then he stepped away into the fog, disappearing like a shadow swallowed whole. By 04:55, Sam's pulse had quickened. The tubes inside the SCR-300 were running hotter now. Hotter than they should. He pressed his palm against the metal chassis and felt warmth radiating through the pack. Too much warmth. The limit was near, but the signal remained clean, strong, unnervingly strong, almost defiant against the interference blanketing the valley. He reminded himself to breathe. As the final minutes crawled forward, he replayed every failure, every flicker of static that had cost men their lives. He remembered how the manual insisted that operators must maintain regulated settings at all times, as if battlefields obeyed regulations. He remembered the instructor at Fort Monmouth dismissing field improvisations as dangerous tinkering by unqualified personnel. And he remembered sitting alone in a tent during Christmas Eve, turning the power knob carefully back and forth, studying the faint tremble of the carrier wave until he found the hidden resonance that no manual ever mentioned. Now, that forbidden resonance carried the lives of an entire battalion. At 05, correct exactly, the assault began. "Go! Go!" The whispers echoed through the ravine as Company A moved out of concealment. Sam relayed the time mark, the updates, the instructions from HQ. The fog swallowed everything but the sound of breathing, the clink of gear, the crunch of boots in mud. He listened for the signal returns, each one a tether binding the battalion together, holding chaos at bay. At 05, the first German flares shot upward, streaks of white fire that burst above the canopy and illuminated the ravine in a ghostly glare. Automatic weapons opened from the hillside. Machine gun fire stitched the earth, snapping branches, kicking up mud. Sam dropped lower, pressing his back against the wall, whispering into the handset with urgent precision. "Thunder 1, adjust route 2 meters east. Heavy fire from Ridge 3. Copy! Thunder 2, suppressing fire requested, coordinates." Another flare erupted, turning the fog into a glowing curtain. Sam's heart hammered as he heard the first call for medic, a voice cracking but clear. The line was holding. The signal was holding. His improvised detent was holding, but only just. At 05:07, a violent crackle tore through the earpiece. The interference spike hit again, sharper this time. Sam adjusted the power knob by a hair, only a hair, and the signal snapped back into clarity. He stared at the radio pack, sweat trickling down his temple despite the cold. The tubes were past safe temperature. He could almost smell the faint metallic heat rising from the electronics. If the filament snapped, the entire battalion would be cut off, but he could not ease the power. Not now. Not when Company A was halfway across open ground. Another transmission came in, frantic, clipped, but intact. "This is Thunder 1. We see movement on ridge, unable to confirm number." Sam relayed it instantly. HQ responded. The heavy weapons platoon adjusted. Mortar crews shifted angle. A coordinated response, all of it held together by a radio operating outside regulation. Then, through the haze, voices began to change pitch. Sam could hear it. The subtle difference between confusion and coordination. The battalion wasn't lost in a fog-blanketed maze anymore. They weren't stumbling into traps. They were synchronized, as if someone had pulled aside the curtain of interference. At 05:14, Company C reported a breakthrough on the eastern slope. At 05:16, the heavy machine gun nest that had been haunting the ridge for days fell silent under mortar fire, guided by perfectly timed coordinates. At 05:19, a runner arrived, breathless, eyes wide, mud splattered across his face. "Signal's perfect. Command says keep whatever you're doing." Sam didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands were shaking now. Not from fear, from the knowledge that he was balancing the radio on a knife edge of heat and overvoltage. He listened again, scanning the bandwidth for signs of collapse. Nothing. Just the clean hum of a carrier wave singing in defiance of everyone who ever said such a thing wasn't possible. At 05:02, another flare went up, German this time, illuminating the hillside. But the battalion was already shifting position in perfect tandem, moving with timing measured in seconds, not minutes. The enemy fire slackened, then wavered. By 05:30, the first reports of retreating German positions came through the net. Sam let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The signal trick, the one he was never supposed to use, had bought them the cohesion needed to survive the opening minutes of the assault. But the hardest part still lay ahead, and Sam could feel the radio burning hotter with every passing second. At 05:32 a.m., and as the eastern ridge finally began to break open under the coordinated push of the 141st, the SCR 300 on Sam Halperin's back felt like a furnace strapped to his spine. He shifted his weight carefully, terrified that even the vibration of his own movements could jolt the tubes out of alignment. The narrow in-between detent, his forbidden signal trick, had held for nearly an hour now. That alone felt like a violation of physics or luck or both. He could almost imagine the filaments inside glowing bright orange, thin as hair, and hotter than they were ever designed to be. The fog had begun to thin slightly, not enough to clear vision but enough for Sam to see movement across the ravine. Company A was advancing in a staggered formation, hugging the terrain, their figures flickering between shadows and half-light. Company C was climbing the far slope, their forms barely visible as dim silhouettes against the gray sky. And Sam could hear something new in the radio net, something he had not heard in days of fighting around Casino: confidence. Not recklessness, not bravado, just the quiet steadiness of men who finally felt the ground shift in their favor. Captain Hargrove's voice cut through the earpiece, terse, controlled, unmistakable. Signal, keep the line open. Company C is requesting an immediate relay to artillery. They spotted an emplacement behind Ridge 3. Copy, sir, Sam answered, though his throat felt dry. He relayed the coordinates, heard the distant thud of friendly artillery moments later, and listened as the net erupted in overlapping confirmations. A chain reaction of precision that only worked because the signal was arriving with perfect timing. Perfect timing. He knew what that meant. The tubes were overstressed. The moment the resonance slipped, the radio would not gently degrade. It would collapse instantly. He could destroy the pack entirely. But at that point, the radio wasn't equipment. It was a lifeline, a bridge, holding together hundreds of lives threading through gunfire and fog. At 05:37, a sudden burst of static exploded through his headset. Sam clenched his jaw, adjusting the power knob an imperceptible degree. The interference smoothed out like a twitching muscle going still. He breathed again. But now he could see thin curls of vapor rising from the radio casing. Not steam. Heat. The tubes were cooking. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his glove. The cold air bit into his skin, a cruel contrast to the searing warmth radiating from the equipment. He knew this couldn't last, but he also knew the battalion was still crossing some of the most exposed terrain of the operation. If they lost coordination now, they'd be caught halfway between two defensive lines, the worst possible place to be. At 05:40, a runner from Company B stumbled toward him, panting, gripping the edge of the ruined wall where Sam sat. They said to tell you, whatever you're doing, don't stop. The soldier's voice shook with adrenaline. Mud streaked his cheeks like paint. They said the timing is perfect. We're hitting everything before they can reposition. Sam nodded without speaking. His hands were trembling slightly, but he kept them steady enough to adjust the tuning with tiny, precise movements. The runner vanished back into the fog. The next few minutes unfolded like clockwork. Artillery shifted right. Company C gained another 20 meters of ground. Machine gun fire from the German nests faltered, then fell silent as mortar teams zeroed in with uncanny accuracy. The battalion was no longer reacting. It was dictating the battle. But then at 05:47 it happened. A sharp metallic pop echoed from inside the radio pack. Sam froze. No, not yet. Not now. He yanked the headset away from his ear just as a shrill feedback screech tore through the line. His heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped to his knees behind the wall and swung the radio around to inspect it. A thin line of smoke curled from the vent slots in the casing. One of the tubes was failing. He knew the signs. The filament inside was collapsing, its fragile support straining under heat far beyond tolerance. He had minutes at most, maybe seconds. He grabbed his toolkit, a small pouch of field repair tools meant only for basic servicing, and tore it open with his teeth. He wasn't supposed to open the radio during active transmission. He wasn't supposed to open it at all outside rear area maintenance tents, but protocol meant nothing now. If the net went dead, men would start dying within minutes. He unlatched the casing quickly, fingers moving with the urgency of a surgeon operating on a patient whose pulse was fading fast. The inner compartment glowed with an eerie orange light, like embers trapped inside a metal box. The vacuum tubes pulsed faintly. The second largest tube, the one regulating power output, was visibly shimmering, its filament sagging dangerously. He had no replacement, no spares, no official fix. But he did have something else. Something he had noticed weeks earlier, when he first discovered the signal trick. The tube's failure mode wasn't instant. Under extreme heat, its contacts loosened microscopically. If pressure was applied directly, carefully, the filament could restabilize long enough to keep operating. It was insane, it was dangerous, and it was the only option. Sam wrapped a strip of cloth around his index finger, prayed it would be enough insulation, and reached inside the radio. The heat bit through the cloth immediately. He winced but didn't pull back. His finger pressed against the metal casing of the failing tube. Steady pressure, just enough to reconnect the loosening contact point. The radio crackled. The carrier wave steadied. Sam exhaled shakily. He held his finger there, letting the heat seep into him, letting the pain anchor him to the task. Every second stretched out like a lifetime. Signal. Report. Captain Hargrove's voice snapped through the headset, urgent. Sam didn't dare remove his hand. He answered through clenched teeth. Signal clear. Maintaining line. He could hear shouting behind the captain. Weapons firing, boots splashing through mud, a sergeant yelling coordinates. The battalion was still advancing. They still depended on him. Minutes passed. 2, 3, 5. Sam's vision blurred from the pain pulsing through his finger and into his hand. The heat was now a constant throbbing presence, threatening to make him drop the tube. But he forced himself to stay still. He anchored himself to memory. Kravitz laughing, Delgado whispering stories about home, Mac telling jokes while shaving in a broken mirror. The men he had lost. The men he refused to lose today. At 05:55, the radio net surged with overlapping transmissions. Company A had reached the last trench line below the ridge. Company C was flanking the remaining German positions. The heavy weapons platoon was setting up final fire points. The battalion was on the edge of something they had never achieved before in these hills. Coordinated breakthrough. Sam blinked sweat from his eyes. The fog outside had thinned enough for him to see the outline of Hargrove waving men forward. German fire was weakening. The tide was turning. But the tube under Sam's finger was beginning to vibrate. A sign it was moments from total failure. He needed one last call. One last successful relay to lock the battalion's positions and complete the maneuver. One last breath of life from the dying machine. He gritted his teeth and pressed harder. The carrier wave held. He whispered into the handset with steady resolve, delivering the final confirmation to HQ. And across the ridge, he heard the answer. Coordinates locked. Fire mission commencing. A distant roar filled the valley as American artillery thundered in perfect harmony with the battalion's advance. The hillside shuddered. The remaining German nests shattered under the impact. Sam held the tube until his vision swam with white spots. At 06:01 a.m., the filament finally gave out with a soft, pitiful sigh. The radio died. But by then, the breakthrough was already secured. At 06:01 a.m., when the SCR-300 finally exhaled its last breath and went silent in Sam Halperin's hands, the battle outside had shifted into something the battalion had not experienced once in the grim, grinding ordeal of Monte Cassino. Momentum. Real, undeniable momentum. The kind that came only when dozens of moving parts aligned in a way no planner could ever fully predict. But every soldier recognized the moment it happened. The radio's death felt, for a heartbeat, like the world collapsing around Sam. The sudden quiet in his headset left a ringing void in his ears. He stared at the darkened tubes, still glowing faintly with residual heat, and for a split second fear stabbed him with cold precision. But then the valley answered for him. From the hillside, a shout rose above the fog. Not a cry of pain or confusion, but something sharper, stronger. A surge of voices moving in coordination, the unmistakable cadence of a line advancing with confidence. Sam pulled himself upright, cradling the now useless radio. The fog had thinned further, revealing flashes of movement across the slope. Company C pushing toward the last trench line. Company A reinforcing the flank. The heavy weapons platoon positioning itself with purpose instead of desperation. He didn't need a working radio to know what had happened. The final relay he'd squeezed out of the dying SCR-300 had locked the artillery mission precisely where it needed to be. The German strongpoints that had strangled the ravine for days were now rubble. The battalion was pushing through, finally breathing air not filtered through fear and static. Sam allowed himself a single moment of relief, a quiet, private exhale, before adrenaline dragged him back to reality. He had to rejoin the battalion. He had to get eyes on the companies now operating without real-time communication. And he had to find another way to coordinate once the fog cleared enough for visual signals. He slung the dead radio back onto his shoulders. It felt heavier now, not because of weight but because of everything it had cost him. His index finger throbbed beneath the soot-stained cloth, the burned skin pulsing with each heartbeat. He clenched his jaw and moved. At 06:07, he reached the base of the slope. Men rushed past him, some shouting for ammunition, others ducking under stray bullets from the last surviving German pockets. The fog rolled in waves, catching bits of sunlight now struggling to break through the overcast sky. The morning was no longer a shapeless void. It was becoming a battlefield with outlines, with defined edges, with hope threading its way through the cold. A staff sergeant grabbed Sam's arm as he passed. "Signals out?" Sam nodded. "Radio's dead. Burned a tube. Hell of a time for it," the sergeant muttered. But then he looked toward the ridge where a fresh burst of rifle fire echoed. "Doesn't matter. You got us through the worst of it." Sam didn't answer. Praise didn't land easily on him. It felt wrong somehow. He had broken regulations, pushed equipment beyond safety, risked everything on a trick no one else would have dared to use. And yet, if he hadn't, he didn't allow himself to finish the thought. The battlefield would have written that ending for him. He pressed forward. At 06:14, as he climbed the incline, the world suddenly burst open with noise. A German MG-42, the dreaded Hitler's buzzsaw, yelled from somewhere higher up. Its ripping, blistering fire tore across the slope, sending men diving behind rocks. Sam threw himself flat as dirt erupted inches from his boots. The machine gun nest was firing blind through the fog, but blind fire was deadly enough. If left unchecked, it could stall Company C's advance. A corporal crawled beside Sam, panting hard. "We need artillery again." Sam swallowed. "Radio's out." The corporal stared at him like a man watching hope slip away. Then Sam did something he never imagined he would do. He stood up. Not fully, just enough to see over the rock. The fog swirled, revealing a faint silhouette of the MG-42 emplacement, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning behind a curtain. He could mark it visually. He could triangulate it. And he knew, from hours and hours spent listening to the battlefield, roughly where the heavy weapons platoon had set up. He shouted toward the rear, where mortarmen were setting up again. "Left of the broken pine, 50 meters past the ridge break. Fire on my mark." The corporal grabbed him. "You're insane." But Sam was already watching the pattern of the MG-42's bursts. He waited for the lull, the moment every German gunner needed to swap barrels or shift belts. The fog thinned enough for him to see the faintest movement, the gunner repositioning. Sam raised his arm. "Now!" The mortar round hissed overhead like a comet carving through smoke. It landed 5 meters short, exploding into the slope with a violent roar. Dirt showered the hillside. The MG-42 hesitated. Another round flew. This one hit the nest dead on. Silence snapped across the slope as suddenly as the burst of fire had begun. Sam sank behind the rock again, his lungs burning, his heart battering his ribs. The corporal stared at him in disbelief. "You're a damned lunatic," he muttered, breathless. "But a lucky one." Sam shook his head. "Not luck, just timing." He didn't bother explaining further. Not here. Not now. By 06:28, the battalion had pushed past the ridge. German resistance shattered into scattered pockets. Some surrendered, some fled, some fought to the last breath. The hillside was a mosaic of broken positions, abandoned gear, and the eerie quiet that followed chaos. Sam moved with the advancing men, ready to offer any scrap of communication ability he still had. His headset dangled uselessly around his neck, the cord dragging in the dirt. The radio pack felt like a tombstone strapped between his shoulder blades. At 06:41, Captain Hargrove found him near the captured MG-42 nest. The captain's uniform was torn, his left arm streaked with grime, but his eyes were steady. "Halperin," he said, breath fogging in the cold air. "I heard the radio went down." Sam nodded. "Tube failure, sir. Couldn't hold the detent any longer." Hargrove looked toward the valley behind them. The fog layer was lifting. revealing the ravine they'd fought through, now dotted with friendly positions instead of broken bodies. But you held it long enough. Sam didn't answer. He didn't feel pride, just relief that the silence in his headset wasn't carrying the voices of dying men this time. The captain stepped closer. What you did today? You gave us coordination when we should have been stumbling in the dark. He paused. I'm not going to ask how you kept that signal stable. I don't want to know. But the whole battalion owes you. Sam swallowed hard. He felt the burn on his finger pulse again, a reminder of the price. Just did my job, sir. Hargrove let out a faint, tired smile. No, Halperin. You did more than that. The words lingered in the air as the fog finally broke open, letting pale sunlight reach the battered hillside. The battlefield looked different now. Not peaceful, not safe, but changed, as if something that had been locked in stalemate had finally cracked. By 07:10, the companies began reorganizing, tending to the wounded, gathering intelligence from abandoned German positions. The breakthrough they achieved would be marked in official reports as effective coordination under adverse conditions. No mention of the radio trick. No mention of the overloaded tubes held in place by a burning finger. No mention of Sam, and Sam preferred it that way. By 07:18, he sat alone on a rock near the captured ridge, the dead radio beside him, watching the men he had helped save move across the battlefield with steps that felt, for once, like they were moving forward. Years later, when he returned home to Newark, he would become a quiet telephone repairman again, raising 2 daughters, rarely speaking about his service. The SCR-300 trick was never written into any manual. No citation mentioned it. No medal carried its memory. But the men who survived that morning never forgot him. Every February 19th, a few letters arrived at his door. Short, humble notes written in shaky handwriting from Colorado, Texas, New Jersey. They all said the same thing in different words. We're here because you kept the line alive. And somewhere in a quiet room, Sam Halperin would fold the letters gently, place them in a box he never opened for anyone, and whisper to himself the truth the world never recorded. Wars are not won only by generals or by machines or by orders typed on clean paper far from the mud. Sometimes they are won by a radio operator with a burned finger, holding a dying signal together in the fog before dawn.